Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Lianne Potter, cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we're the tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier.
And help make our organizations more prepared to face ever-changing human-centric cyber threats. In this episode, we delve into the murky world of financial crime with its intersection with cybercrime.
Today, our guest is Ray Blake. Ray's an advisor on financial crime matters and co-creator of the Dark Money Files podcast. In this episode, we explore the motivations driving individuals to commit such crimes, probing whether it's sheer greed, the allure of victimless crimes, or a complex mix of factors.
We also talk about the concept of corporate values and how they may not always align with individual morals. We also look at the responsibility and moral hazard inherent in fighting against fraud, highlighting how cybersecurity often wrongly blames the victim rather than focusing on the perpetrator. Now, a word of warning, listeners. We do discuss the dark side of crime in this episode, including things like human trafficking and rape, which some of our listeners may find upsetting. If this episode isn't for you, no hard feelings, do feel free to skip this one, and we'll see you next week.
So with that in mind, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Compromising Positions with Ray Blake.
Welcome, Ray. Thank you for joining us on Compromising Positions.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, okay. So I'm I suppose I'm a bit of a financial crime nerd, really. I've spent a number of years working in the area of financial crime, which is anti-money laundering, anti-fraud, bribery and corruption, and all of the stuff that you can see pretty much every day on Netflix, really. So I've hung around financial services firms mostly, but increasingly some other bit players as well in the kind of ecosystem, helping them fight against this iniquitous influence that kind of, as we know, I think, pervades all of finance across the world. And we've been sanguine about it for too long. We've been complacent for too long. We've been defensive for too long. So I'm kind of all in favour of getting more aggressive about this kind of thing, really.
Before we go into, I think there's some really interesting topics there alone. Do you want to maybe just, you run a podcast yourself, don't you? You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, well, I can. I mean, that's not what I'm here to talk about. But yes, I'm half of the Dark Money Files. We talk about all of this stuff at significant length and have done for a number of years. You can, as they say, you can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you.
So I'm obviously a really big fan of the podcast, which is why I reached out to you, and I thought, right, I want Ray on the show. And the reason why I want you on the show, and people might think, well, financial crime, cybersecurity, what's the link there? But with financial crime and cybersecurity, that kind of link blurring at the moment, I thought you'd be a fantastic person to kind of give us an insight on what really motivates financial crime these days.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I can definitely talk about that. I'm going to have to trust you on there being a significant connection between cybercrime and financial crime, because I must admit it's a bit of a blind spot for me, the whole cyber side of things. But I guess, at the heart of things, crime is crime, right? All crime is acquisitive. It makes somebody money because, if it didn't, it wouldn't happen. They'd do something else and find a different way to make money. So I guess these are just different criminal fingerprints, aren't they, really?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I totally agree that on brass tacks, crime is crime. But if that is the case, then there must be something that's sort of motivating, a commonality that motivates people to think, right, because there's lots of different crimes someone can commit. What really draws people to financial crime when, there's a whole smorgasbord really of crime that people could choose from?
Yeah. No, I mean, there are all sorts of things, I think, that bring people into this arena. And it's probably helpful to distinguish between the actual acquisitive crime itself, which is to say, how somebody is robbed of money or how money is taken away by somebody who's not entitled to have it. And then secondly, how that money is then integrated and cleaned through the financial system, which is the process we call money laundering. And they're two separate crimes, and they're not necessarily committed by the same people either. I mean, one of the things that is a bit of an eye-opener if you're new to this is that here in the UK, certainly, and I think it's probably true globally, there are relatively few people trying to launder money. The National Crime Agency here in the UK reckons there's a very small number of criminal gangs, and I read into that, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 gangs who are responsible for virtually all money money laundering in this country on a wholesale basis. The days of you going out, stealing a small amount of money and then doing your own laundry of that money are long gone. Money laundering isn't a mom and pop business anymore. Now, it stands to reason from that analysis, many times as many criminals who don't engage in money laundering as there are who do. So when you're looking at what motivates people to be criminal in that way, I guess you need to divide the two and say that as far as money laundering is concerned, it's offered as a commercial service, that the people doing it are criminals, the people they're serving are criminals or particularly organised criminals who perhaps are quite demanding customers, I guess, who don't use traditional complaint channels, let's say, if they've got a problem with you. So there are challenges there. But ultimately, you're providing a professional financial service to a bunch of wrong-uns. Whereas if you are the wrong-uns, or, in a small or a large way, you have money that needs cleaning, you've come about that through a variety of criminal typologies. And you've done that because you found that it's easier to earn money that way, given your skill set and your moral worldview. It seems the most appropriate way for you to make a living, or more than a living, to make a fortune, potentially.
I love that. The idea that there's something about your own sort of moral worldview is really interesting. Do you think that there is a cutting point when someone sort of thinks, well, I've tried so hard to make money legitimately, I'm not going to be able to be the millionaire that I've always wanted to be, the sort of Del Boy kind of next year will be millionaires type.
Well,
then so that worldview sort of changes. Do you see that in the sort of research you do when you're researching for the podcast or for your clients and things like that? There is definitely something that shifts in that mindset.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? What I suppose gets to me and worries me is the number of people who are involved in this kind of as a last resort or through an act of desperation, or because they are, in many cases, trafficked into it. They have no choice but to participate in financial crime. So there's a large contingent of people like that. And in poor economic times, that's a growing population. But then you've always got, in any economic times, you've got the people who see an easy way to make a buck. And morality does come into it when we're talking about some of these crimes, because many of these crimes are crimes that, if not victimless or not perceived as victimless, there is a kind of strong feeling sometimes that the victims don't deserve quite as much sympathy as individual people on the street. So, and this is particularly true of cybercrime. There's a view that if you go and hit a big bank, it's not the ordinary customers that are going to suffer. It's not even the bank that are going to suffer. It's some amorphous, sort of insurance and guarantee ecosystem that no one's really worried about taking a hit, which kind of salves your conscience a little bit. In financial crimes like fraud, for instance, and ransomware and all of those things, even if you think, well, actually there is a victim at the end of this, I don't have to interact with them. I don't get exposed to them. That doesn't keep me awake at night. I never know my victim, which also makes it slightly easier from a moral point of view. But, there is the slippery slope argument as well, isn't there? If you compromise your integrity just a little bit, then it's much easier to go from that to compromising it a lot than to find your way back to the path.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting points there. I think one of them is talking about the criminals themselves, and from what I've seen in documentaries, they're now so sophisticated. Some of these, I'll give an example of, there's a lot of cybercrime being perpetrated on individuals through call centres in other countries, and for them it's just that's their day job, which is really, I find really fascinating, because they're not the kingpins, they're not the ones making the mega bucks.
No. And in many ways, they're the cutouts. They're the people who are placing themselves at risk for a relatively fixed level of reward. I've probably seen the same material that you have. You can see that they're on a payroll. These people, they get, bonuses, they have appraisals, and it's just like turning up at any regular office, except that what you're doing is outbound criminal fraudulent phone calls.
And I guess when it comes to people either defrauding people through these kind of schemes or hackers and things like ransomware hackers, in many cases there are, although the businesses are victims, also the impact on individual victims as well. I mean, aside from losing a bit of money, have you actually seen what some of the, or have any insight on what some of the impacts to individuals can be when they're a victim of?
I mean, companies don't really exist. That's the big secret, really, of modern capitalist reality. There is really no such thing as a company. A company can't do anything on its own. It can't feel. It can't react. It can't take an initiative. It cannot enjoy a profit. All of those things have to be done by people. Now, those people might have one of any number of positions in that company. You know, those choices and those rewards aren't exclusive to the shareholders or the employees or the customers or other stakeholders. They collectively represent the kind of the feelings, the nerve system, the central nervous system of what we call a company. So I think you just, in the same way that you would kind of look through a company and say, well, who owns the company? Who are the people behind it? I think you have to do the same thing when you're thinking about, you know, the impact of crime or you know, the impact of positive rewards on companies, because it's completely wasted on the company. You have to look through and see who's actually being affected, the people behind it.
For our listeners, what do you mean the impact of positive rewards?
Well, I mean, for instance, if the corporate tax rate goes down and the company starts making more profit, well, the company doesn't care. You know, the people who own the company care. The employees, if they get some kind of bonus out of that, they care as well. They get a positive impact from that reward. And it's just to make the point, really, that company itself is completely inert. It doesn't have any kind of stimulus or reaction. It relies on the people who make it work to do that. And consequently, you know, when you think of, well, that's a crime against property, that's a crime against no actual people, it's just this faceless organisation. That's never true. That's always sophistry, because there are always people. If there are no people, no one's hurting, and there are always people.
Do you think it's a rationalization technique for many criminals or criminal organisations to get people on side?
I mean, yeah, if it works, they'll use it. I mean, that's the story of organised crime. They will tell you whatever you need to hear in order to do their bidding. Yeah, absolutely. But also, I think it's a position at which people are quite capable of arriving, you know, independently. But also increasingly, you know, in the world that we inhabit, companies have become a little bit faceless, haven't they? You no longer know the people who look after your bank account, for instance. They're, if anything, they're only names on a letter, and often they're not even that, are they? You don't know who is enjoying the money that you spend in your supermarket. You've got no idea. That hasn't been the case during all of human history, but it is one of the defining factors of life in the 21st.
No, I agree. And I think that really doesn't help as well when it comes to, so I'm thinking from a perspective as, you know, I work in cybersecurity and I'm trying to train my colleagues, you know, to spot things and things like that. The company even itself now, because by the very nature of having to scale, has to almost treat employees in a kind of faceless way. And so you say to an employee, well, you don't want the company to go down. Like, well, why do I care if the company goes down or not? You know, if I click on a link, you know, are they making lots of money and paying me very little? So even trying to get people on side is very difficult.
Wow. That's quite dark, Lianne, isn't it, actually? That's quite dark to think about. But no, you are absolutely right. And this is one of those unintended consequences of management sometimes trying to do the right thing, but maybe doing it in a slightly clunky way. For me, one of the big things that I see that always annoys me is when firms try and roll out their values, their corporate values across the firm. And they say to their staff, you know, these are our values. And staff quite rightly say, well, they're not my values. They may well be yours. It's I always say that values are a little bit like toothbrushes. Everyone needs to have them, but nobody really wants to use yours. You know, you should be able to have your own, and you cannot give someone else values.
No.
You can encourage somebody to share your values. You can create the circumstances for them to acquire values that are conducive to, you know, a positive relationship with them. But you know, when you start saying, look, these are the values that I want you to sign up to, you've taken a wrong turn.
Yeah, utterly. And, you know, our sort of tagline for this podcast is protecting your ass X, with the S being kind of the key thing. Because with things like policies, processes and requirements, the only reason why they work in an organization is because that's part of your kind of contract, and it gives us something to point to kind of protect our ass if, said employee goes against that. But there's no real care or consideration into, apart from sometimes organizations make you sign a declaration. I've read this.
It's written down. That's absolutely foolproof now. It's written down. So, over the weekend I read Jenny Radcliffe's book. I don't know if you're familiar.
I am, yeah. So Jenny Radcliffe, the people hacker.
Yeah. It's a very, very enlightening read for a woman who should be, horribly tired and cynical of all the things that she's seen. She doesn't seem to be. She's actually quite warm about people and cares about people and understands the mistakes that they make, but knows that they do make mistakes and that people are always going to be the weak point. However good your paperwork is, however good your policies, your procedures and everything else, people are your vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's always the difficult thing is, in knowing that, where do you blur those lines? Where do you push those boundaries? And one thing I'd like to kind of pick your brains about is something I've been kind of chewing on for a little while in my head, and just mostly based on what I've been seeing sort of play out in the press.
Okay.
And that is the kind of onus of responsibility. Now, I'm obviously thinking this from an onus of responsibility in terms of a hack happens, for example, and therefore who should be blamed? Is it the person who maybe clicked on that link, or, is it the company? But what I'm not really seeing is, which is, I'd like to get your perspective on this from a sort of financial crime experience, is very rarely we demonize the actual hacker, the actual cyber criminal who's done the deed. Automatically, the kind of blame goes on to either the person who clicked on it or that company who, maybe didn't put the right controls in place. No one ever thinks, actually, this person is an out-and-out criminal who had malicious intent from the start to do wrong by this person, this organization. But I think it might be due to the fact that these individuals, these cyber criminals, we can't really put our finger on them. They're kind of ephemeral. They're kind of, an assailant and binary. We never can really understand who they are. So therefore, when it comes to attribution of blame, it's really difficult. And I think that has a consequence on victim blaming within cybersecurity. And I was just wondering, how does that kind of thing play out in financial crime? And is there anything we can learn from that?
Well, I think actually that there are lessons to be learned in both directions. I mean, it's probably worth talking about the whole burden of liability here when it comes to fraud now, because we have proposals which if they're enacted will enlarge a largely voluntary scheme at the moment into something that will become compulsory. And if you are defrauded by somebody such that you agree to transfer money to them thinking they're somebody that they purport to be but they're really not, from your bank account, and consequently you've lost money, you've always been able to go to your bank and say to the bank, actually, I've been defrauded, can you refund me please? And the bank in the old days used to say, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you. You have authorized that transfer. You've said yes. How are we supposed to know that you didn't think about it sufficiently before you hit the yes button? In recent years, there's been a voluntary code where the banks have taken the view that, well, actually, we provide these facilities which have made it easier for the customers to go about their day-to-day life, but also have made it quite easy for fraudsters to subvert that system. That's not our customers' fault. So actually, we ought to be refunding our customers in that situation. Now, that's created quite an interesting position as far as moral hazard is concerned, because you're quite right, Lianne, so far, we haven't mentioned the criminal at all. The criminal hasn't been penalised as any part of this. The criminals come in, swipe the apples, and the greengrocer said, oh, never mind, have some more. And it's cost the greengrocer money. The customer has been made whole, and that's great, and that's as it should be. The bank's out of pocket, and there is no disincentive on the criminal just to keep doing it. In fact, quite the opposite, because the criminal, had the criminal got a conscience, would now understand that it's not the poor customer who's out of pocket. It's actually going to end up being the bank who's out of pocket. So consequently, the new requirements, which were kind of consulted over a long period by the payment systems regulator, said what we want to do, rather than require the customer's bank to make that refund, we want them to share it with the recipient's bank. So wherever that money goes off to, that's in a bank bank somewhere, and that is controlled by the criminal. So those guys are going to have to put their hands in their pockets as well, because up until now, they hadn't been involved in most situations. Now, suddenly, you've got people saying, I'm not only going to try and protect against victims of this fraudulent activity, it's also in my interest to start identifying perpetrators of this activity. And you can see the chain of thought there that gets us to that place that says, yes, that is a good thing. We ought to be, rebalancing, reintroducing an appropriate moral hazard to all of this. Now, unfortunately, we've created a new one in doing so, because all of a sudden the customer is also in a position to say, well, I no longer rely on my bank's goodwill to do this. The bank absolutely has to refund this money if I've lost it. But what if I only pretend to have lost it? What if I say I've lost a couple of £1,000 or £10,000 or whatever, and the bank can't prove me wrong, so they'll have to refund me? And, oh, look, it's a victimless crime. I've made a little bit of money. We're all very happy, aren't we? Now, lots of people are up in arms about that and saying, well, we are creating this new moral hazard. We are inviting otherwise legitimate and fair-minded customers into crime. Well, it's a very similar argument for me between self-service supermarkets and the old-fashioned grocer, where, you had to hand stuff across the counter. There comes a point at which you accept, for the convenience and benefit of many, one or two people are going to rip you off.
Do we have much evidence, I guess anecdotal or otherwise, in the industry that people are actually using that as a method for defrauding banks?
I mean, it's happened. It is a line on MI in most banks. It's a phenomenon that's being observed. But I would suggest to you, Jeff, we've got years and years, decades, centuries of evidence from human nature that if that opportunity exists, there will be people who identify and exploit that. I was just going to... I've taken ages to answer what was actually a simple question, and I haven't done it yet, because the simple question is, what can money laundering learn from that side of things? But one thing that they can learn from this is that has created massive financial incentive on the banks and other institutions to stop messing about and actually solve this problem. Because every time they have to put their hand in their pocket and refund a victim, it's costing them money. It's bleeding them money immediately. So now they have a very, very strong incentive to actually fix that, to make it much, much harder, which they haven't had to the same extent before, because they could always, in the old days, say to the customer, sorry, you're full. Or somehow it wasn't as prevalent. You didn't have a large number of customers knowing that they had certain unexercised rights that they could go and exercise if they wanted to. But now that there is this very real financial incentive. Now, there's never been, and there still isn't, that incentive on the money laundering side. When a bank solves money laundering, it loses money. It doesn't save money, it loses it, because it closes accounts that it makes fees on, it stops transactions that earn it money. If it is successful in stopping financial crime, it costs it more money, on top of the money that it's already spent detecting the financial crime. Now, the lucky thing is that the controls that you would need to fix fraud are quite similar to the ones that you would need for financial crime. So consequently, my hope, and the hope of many commentators, I think, is that by forcing the bank's arms in this way to do the right thing on fraud, there will be a nice side effect, which is that it's much harder for money launderers to get through them as well, because the sea rises and all ships rise, including anti-money laundering along with anti-fraud.
Do you think the cybercrime, I read recently, by 2025 is going to become a $5 trillion industry and represent one of the biggest transfers of wealth in human history?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a crazy number, isn't it? Do you think that cybercrime now, I guess the scale and the speed at which we can do it is shifted the focus of financial crime, or is it now becoming kind of a bit of a blurred line? It's almost what percentage of financial crime is now also cybercrime?
Well, I don't care. It's still crime, isn't it, Jeff? To be honest, crime. Seriously, crime is crime. And, not to get too philosophical about it, but to what extent is money that's theoretical and lives in a computer system any different than the pieces of paper that cross a counter from a certain philosophical and economical standpoint? None of it's really real in any case. So, but let's not pull at that thread. We'll all be out on our ear, won't we? But no, ultimately, crime is crime. That seems to be the currently most straightforward, easiest, most fashionable way of acquiring large amounts of money very quickly. It will either get shut down or it will suck up all the available money in the world. And then where will we be?
Great. One thing I'd like to kind of pick your brains out as well is, so when I think of sort of said ransomware gangs, and they're making millions upon millions, and what they do,
yes.
So some of them are even as blatant as they'll share information about these Lamborghinis they've bought and all sorts of things. They're quite flashy when they do it. So I was thinking, like, what point do when you're sort of in a ransomware gang making all this money that you decide, actually, it's time to retire? And can you retire? Is it a bit like the gangster kind of mentality? You can never really retire because you know too much, or is it kind of the same in, you sort of see big corrupt CEOs, for example, that go above and beyond to make like millions illegitimately. Where does it stop? Where do you stop feeling motivated to keep stealing money? And can you once you get that far in?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If there were to be such a thing as the Oxford English Dictionary of Capitalism, and you were to look up under the letter E and try and find the word enough, you'd find it's omitted. It's a curious omission. There is no such thing as enough in capitalism. You see, the mistake that people make is that people think that capitalism is about ownership. Mm-hmm. That the aim of capitalism, the value in capitalism, comes from owning things. It really doesn't. All of the benefits, all of the joy, all of the enjoyment in capitalism comes from acquiring things, not owning them. If you've ever had a collecting habit, for instance, you will know that the most valuable item in the collection is the next one that you're going to buy.
Yes.
And then as soon as you've bought it, suddenly it's not as shiny as it was anymore. It's not as lovely. It's not that same object of desire that it was just before you owned it, which means that to get back to the same place and to get that same buzz again, you need to move on to the next acquisition. Now, that never ends. No matter how big your collection is, no matter how many times you acquire something, you always need to acquire more. Unfortunately, that's the thing. If you are busy economically, legitimately or illegitimately, and you are acquiring more and more and more possessions, you will never reach the point where you have enough. You are like a shark who will stop breathing if you stop moving.
That's it feels like we're almost about to quote Ian Fleming's Goldfinger. He talks about the fact that he wants to create a masterpiece in crime. He wants to create something that's just so absurd that just not for the money, but to create a masterpiece. And it is like that prestige of acquisition. And the way you paint that there, correct me if I'm wrong here, is almost that the aims of legitimate capitalism, which I guess is a question itself, and the illegitimate side of it are almost the same. The motivations and the aims are the same.
I firmly believe that they are. Yeah, they're exactly the same. The only difference is that we as a society have a view about which means are fair and legitimate and which aren't, and that's just a consensus.
How do you get people at an organisational level start taking financial crime seriously? And what lessons can cybersecurity teams learn from your experience in that respect?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think intellectually, we all know that the best way to acquire good judgment is to start with quite poor judgment and to experience the consequences of poor judgment. So, I mean, in many ways, the keenest user of security measures is someone who's already been burned. So you would get people in the frame of mind that they have been burned, that they will be burned tomorrow, that this could happen at any moment. But, obviously there comes a point when that's counterproductive because, you make people afraid to do absolutely anything at all, and commerce grinds to a halt, and so does work. But I think one of the things that doesn't often help, although it's counterintuitive, is repeating those messages ad infinitum. And let me give you an example of why not. And it comes back to something that we've already talked about, which is this authorized push payment, the banking fraud that we talk about. Now, I remember when this started rearing its head as a significant factor in retail banking. A small number of years ago now, we all got emails, didn't we, and letters from our banks saying, beware of this, look out for this might happen. It's very important and you can call, and there's this helpline, and don't click on links or whatever. And many of us read that and thought, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. That sounds fairly sensible. And then, maybe a few months later, we'd have got another one worded slightly differently, but with the same key messages, and we all said fine. Now, unfortunately, I get one of those on a weekly basis now. I don't read them. I don't read any of them. I just completely ignore them. In fact, my attitude is stop sending me this. I'm irritated by it. Now, that is not conducive to me acting in the way that you want me to act. If you're my bank, you do not want me so irritated by the security message that I kind of feel that security is my enemy, because you keep pinging me, you keep annoying me, you keep wasting my time with this stuff. Subconsciously, there's something going on there, which is I'm not going to play with this. I'm not going to engage in this activity. So I think firms can very often overcook it, and firms can very often set up people to unconsciously rebel against the security protocols. And you do see that happening, I think. People who you would not imagine would be unaware or naive seem to have proved so. And often what you find there is that they knew fully well what they should have done. In fact, if anything, they knew it too well. They'd heard it too many times. And I just wonder in those cases whether it's got to the point of becoming an irritant, and, subconsciously that's worked against.
Well, nobody wants to be told what to do they?
So
that's at the end of the day, and to be constantly told what to do. People want to say, well, I'm not silly enough to fall for this. Or maybe, a bit of cognitive distance, that they're going to kind of be in that mindset.
I mean, it's partly that. It's partly stop telling me I've got it. It's okay. Or, I'm a big boy. I'm a big girl now. I don't need this level of mothering. Or for whatever reason, it's going to rub people up the wrong way if it's too frequent or too shouty.
I agree. And I think as an industry, we don't do that very well. And again, I think a lot of it is just due to a lot of covering our own asses, to be honest. We can at least say, well, did you not see all those notifications? We told you not to do this.
No, absolutely. But I mean, it's no good me just saying don't do this rather than do this instead. I'm not sure how it would work in cybersecurity, but definitely what gets a lot of traction for me when I'm talking to people at all levels, whether that's the board of a multinational or people just starting in their first line position in a bank, and that is talking to people about victims of financial crime. So, if you talk to people about, £5 million losses or £263 million fines, to pluck a figure out of the air, none of that really resonates in the same way as telling a personal story about somebody who has been physically, emotionally, or financially hurt by financial crime. So when we look at an item of money laundering that a bank has let happen, maybe they've been fined for it. You don't know. They've let it through. Some money laundering has happened. Well, before the money laundering happened, and in order to make the money laundering necessary, somebody had to criminally acquire a large amount of money. Now, they may have done that through any number of ways. One of the ways they'll have done it is by engaging in human trafficking. And somewhere north of 25 million people in the world today are in the process of being trafficked or have been trafficked and are now engaged in what we charmingly call modern slavery, which is indentured servitude. They are working not for their own benefit, but for their criminal masters, sometimes in the most appalling situations and conditions. Women who are trafficked across the world, sometimes not even women, sometimes girls, whose fate is to live in squalor and be raped 20 times a night for cash. effectively, not cash that they ever see any of, obviously. Now, you cannot possibly have empathy for 25 million people, but you can have empathy for one or two whose stories you understand, who have spoken to you, or who you've been told about. You've seen their world, you've seen their life, you've heard what happens to them. I think you will do a lot more to help that person or to prevent more things like that happening than you will to save your bank a £15 million fine or to stop a transfer that doesn't quite tick all of the boxes.
It does put a real context on the, money laundering. That's a bit, crime as a service. Or it's somebody's had their, stolen Bitcoin laundered versus your story, which is obviously much more impactful and might actually make people consider their position on it a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I don't make any apology for making people cry when I tell some of these stories. They do, bankers sometimes are painted in a light that sees them as, these heartless creatures. There is nothing like being in an investment bank and the lights coming up and seeing a few people wiping tears away to make you realise that that's not really a fair stereotype. Yeah, and I don't mind that because, I started my career years and years ago in sales, and any salesperson will tell you, unless you can distress someone in some way, unless you can disturb them, they will never act. And I've taken that very much to heart.
I think that's such a lovely point in which, we can sort of come to a conclusion with this. It's a fantastic guest you've been. That change the narrative. Like let's stop thinking, in these sort of big picture terms. Jeff says 5 trillion. Who cares? But you think about. I think about when I do inductions for people, new starters, and I talk about cybersecurity. I don't talk about the cybersecurity in an organization. I tell them about the time when I was sat on the bus, and then I had a ping from Amazon saying someone in Edinburgh is trying to access your account, and I was on a bus in Leeds, and just being aware that actually things can happen, and that person did end up taking quite a significant amount of money out of my account. And luckily, because of the bank scheme, I did get that back. But yeah, like you said, once bitten, twice shy. Those stories and understanding like the financial impact right around Christmas as well, that kind of double whammy of that pain and stress and anxiety that I experienced is
yeah. And you were in Leeds taking a bus. You needed that money.
It shows the power of storytelling in both areas, though, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. And the sad fact of it is you don't need to make these stories up. There are enough people who will tell you exactly what happened. You don't need to dress this up with additional details. Yeah. It's all there.
And impacts us all so much as well. And I think it's only ever going to increase really until organisations, banks, government all kind of say, right, we're really going to make a concerted effort because it's just costing us too much money to put a sticking plaster on this now. We actually need to take more evasive action. Well, Ray, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
Yes,
and throughout, I've just made so many connections with cybersecurity and what we can learn from your experience. Yeah, loads.
Okay. I was worried that you might not be able to because, as I say, it's a bit of a closed book to me. But I'm glad
I'm
it's
sure our
worked
listeners
for you
will be
anyway.
able to make loads of parallel comparisons in terms of knowing thine enemy is a kind of a really good one. I think, but also I think that idea that you brought to a close about let's focus on the victim here. Let's not focus on the actual money side of it because that's not really going to get us anywhere. But let's tell these stories just to raise awareness. And once you've sort of got people's eyes and ears on this, you can really probably do some good works. And I have no doubt it's probably how when you were discussing the banks taking the decisions, like let's collaborate on this and let's kind of all put our hands in our pockets on this because that's the only way it's going to get sorted.
Yeah.
And I think cybersecurity organizations can learn a lot, or the practice of cybersecurity can learn a lot by saying, let's collaborate more. Because one thing I do see a lot is, when stuff goes down from a cybersecurity perspective, a company gets hacked, the cybersecurity community is not very friendly towards those teams on the front line working in that security department. Like, where were you? You dropped the ball here, didn't you? And there's a lot of demonization. Whereas we could learn so much by talking to each other about, well, yes, this did happen to me. Don't forget it was a criminal with motive and intent that did this to me. We could talk about it, share best practices, so you can be protected the next time. So you don't have to go through what I've been through. We're not quite there yet. So listeners, I'm hoping take heed. Think about that when you post kind of sneering comments on LinkedIn or anywhere else, like Discord and things about these cybersecurity teams. that have suffered a breach. Perhaps, we could learn from that rather than demonize people for it.
That's something that I took from Jenny's book, actually, where she has written into all of her contracts that as a result of her work, nobody gets fired.
Love that. No, that is really important.
The security holes that she exposes and the people who do the wrong thing are trained, absolutely, but they're not fired.
And I think that there is so much fear around if I go to someone and say, hi, I work in cybersecurity, I'd like to speak to you, their instant thought is, what have I done wrong? And that's totally not what I want. I want people to go, oh, no, I'm just introducing myself, just in case something does go wrong, you know who to talk to. But yeah, we get that quite a lot. And I think there is, still quite a lot of organisations, I'm happy to say, not the ones I've worked in, that take that view of, actually, if someone clicks on something, they're going to get fired the next day.
It is a very punitive, from a personal and an organisational level. It's all, and from a governmental and governance level, it's all very punitive. And I'd say that probably stems the flow of information sharing and honesty and lessons learned, because everybody's covered it up because I don't want to get fired or sued or have my company shut down.
Yeah. Do you know what? There's so much to talk about here, isn't there? You've been trying to close this down for the last 5 minutes. I'm reminded of when we go and visit family with my wife, who says, okay, it's time to go now. I stand up and get ready to go. And then she starts the tour of the room, which takes about 20 minutes before we actually go. It's a bit like that, really.
Yeah, well, I've loved every minute of it. Is there anything else you wanted to add before you go, Ray? Is there anything you'd like to plug?
No. I don't do that sort of thing. I'm here for you and your listeners on this occasion. So,
if Ray's not going to do it, I'm going to say this: his podcast is fantastic, so it will be in the show notes. Do check it out. I really recommend it.
Oh, that's very kind.
That was some episode. I learned a lot about the complexities of financial and cybercrime there. That's a lot to take away. I knew it'd be great.
We underscored the harsh reality that there is no limit to the accumulation of wealth, and there's a thin line separating the legitimate and illegitimate pursuits of capital.
One thing that I really thought was interesting was what Ray was talking about when he delivers his talks on financial crime. For me, what I'm going to take away from it is that power of personal narratives as a potential tool for creating empathy and spurring people into action, which is far more effective than using big statistics.
For me, one of the key takeaways was the need to understand the adversary. They always say, know thine enemy. And we need to do that in order to combat the more sophisticated and evolving world of digital financial crime effectively.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, that's another episode in the can. So links to everything Ray discussed in the episode can be found in the show notes. If you do like the show, please do leave us a review.
Follow us on all good podcasting platforms and via our YouTube channel. And don't forget to share on LinkedIn and in your teams.
It really helps us when you do that to spread the word and get high quality guests in like Ray on future episodes. We hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time. Keep secure. And don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?